The rain came in sideways. Clara watched it through the tinted window of the van, the way it hit the streetlights at an angle, the way it made the street in front of her house look like something from a different kind of story than the one she had been living. Softer, maybe. More honest. Rain didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She had been in the van for 47 minutes. The monitors on the equipment rack showed 4 angles of the house interior. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, the rear patio. The feeds were clean and sharp. The same camera system she had helped the FBI's technical team route through the existing smart home infrastructure 2 weeks ago. At 2 in the morning, while Greg slept in the master bedroom with the white noise machine he required, and the temperature set to 68 degrees because anything above that made his nerve damage flare. On the kitchen monitor, Greg was standing at the counter, not in the wheelchair, not struggling, not performing the particular labored quality of a man whose life had been taken from him at a stoplight on a Tuesday afternoon, standing the way a person stood when they were completely comfortable in their own body, weight distributed evenly. One hand on the counter, the other wrapped around a beer he had opened himself. From the refrigerator he had walked to, on the legs that the settlement documents had described as permanently, catastrophically, and irreversibly damaged. He was showing someone his golf swing. The someone was a friend. Clara recognized him from the party that had apparently started 20 minutes after her car turned off the block. And the friend was laughing, and Greg was laughing, and the sound came through the van's audio feed with the particular clarity of a surveillance system that had been calibrated by people who did this professionally. The FBI commander beside her had a radio in his hand. He was not using it yet. He was watching the monitor. "How long?" Clara said. He glanced at her. He had the specific quality of someone who had done this many times, and had learned that the people who sat in the van waiting had a particular need for information that was not always compatible with operational timing. "A few more minutes," he said. "We want his friends in the room." Clara nodded. She looked at the house through the rain. She had lived in that house for 18 months. She had bathed a man in that house and emptied his bedpans and woken at 3 in the morning to turn him so his skin wouldn't break down, and cleaned soup off the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, and apologized. She had apologized. She had said "I'm sorry" in that house more times than she could count, for things that were not her fault, for the speed of her hands, and the temperature of his water, and the particular inadequacy of her presence in a situation she had believed was the worst thing that had ever happened to them both. She had believed it was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. It was, in fact, the best thing that had ever happened to Greg. On the kitchen monitor, he set down his beer and demonstrated the follow-through of his backswing, rotating his torso with the easy range of motion of a man whose body gave him no trouble at all. His friend said something. Greg laughed. Clara put her hands in her lap. She thought about a pharmacy line, 22 days ago, and a phone screen, and a live feed that had loaded with the ordinary, indifferent efficiency of a $30 pet camera, doing exactly what it had been purchased to do. She thought about the drive home. She thought about walking through the front door, to understand how a man could fake paralysis for 2 years, collect $5 million, and turn his wife into a slave, to understand how the Sunday afternoon that was currently playing out on 4 monitors in an FBI surveillance van had been constructed piece by piece, from a fender bender at 15 miles per hour. You needed to go back. Back to the stoplight, back to the moment Clara's marriage became something else entirely. She had always known Greg was someone who looked for angles. This was not, in the early years of their relationship, a quality she had assessed negatively. She had read it as intelligence, as strategic thinking, as the particular kind of ambition that belonged to people who were unwilling to accept the first version of a situation when a better version might be available. He was quick to find the loophole in a contract, quick to identify the leverage in a negotiation, quick to understand who in a room had the power and what they wanted. She had found this attractive, in the way that specific kinds of competence were attractive to people who valued it. What she had not fully understood, in the years before the accident, was the relationship between that quickness and patience. Greg could wait. He could wait with a stillness that did not feel like waiting, because he was comfortable in the interval between identifying an opportunity and acting on it. He had been waiting, she eventually understood, for exactly the right opportunity, the one with sufficient upside to justify the required commitment, the one that solved the specific problem of his working life, which was that he had always believed he was worth more than what he was being paid, and had never found a route to the life he believed he deserved. The stoplight was at the intersection of Meridian and Fifth. A commercial trucking company's delivery vehicle had rear-ended his car at what the accident report estimated as 15 miles per hour. The impact had crumpled the back bumper. Greg's car had been pushed forward approximately 3 feet. The airbags had not deployed. Clara had gotten the call 40 minutes after it happened. She had driven to the scene and found Greg in the back of an ambulance, strapped to a board, with a neck brace he had apparently requested from the paramedics before they'd had a chance to assess him. His face, when she arrived, was doing something she had never seen it do before, a specific quality of controlled anguish. The expression of a man managing enormous pain, every feature arranged toward the communication of suffering. "I can't feel my legs," he said. She had taken his hand. She had been terrified. The MRIs showed nothing catastrophic. This was the fact that the attorney, a man named Dennis Farrell, who operated out of an office with a billboard that Clara would later drive past every day for 2 years, had built his case around. Not the presence of damage, but the absence of visible damage in the context of reported symptoms. The human spine, Farrell had explained in the first consultation Clara attended, was capable of sustaining micro-level trauma that did not appear on standard imaging, but produced real, documentable neurological effects. The absence of evidence was not, in his framing, evidence of absence. Greg's symptoms were, by this point, well established. He had spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and in those 3 weeks he had been assessed by a neurologist, a physical therapist, and 2 pain management specialists, all of whom had encountered a patient who was consistent in his reported experience and whose test responses, the reflexes, the sensation mapping, the motor function evaluations produced results that were, if not conclusive, at least ambiguous enough to be documented. Clara had sat in every appointment. She had held his hand in every appointment. She had asked the questions he couldn't think of when he was in pain. And she had taken notes on her phone. And she had driven him home from each one with the specific, focused care of a person who understood that the ordinary logistics of a life had shifted, and that the shifting required her to absorb more of the weight. She had not, in any of those 3 weeks, considered that the weight was not real. The trucking company's insurance settled 13 months after the accident. $5 million. The number arrived in the form of a phone call from Farrell on a Thursday afternoon, and Greg had been sitting in the wheelchair in the living room of the apartment they'd been renting since the accident. And when Clara repeated the number to confirm she had heard correctly, and she had thought at the time that this was grief, that this was a man confronting the price that had been put on his destroyed life, cried. He had cried with his face in his hands. She had gone to him. She had knelt beside the wheelchair and put her arms around him and felt his shoulders shake. "It doesn't feel like enough," he'd said. "No," she'd said, "it doesn't." She had meant it. The house was Greg's decision, in every particular. The location, the size, the specific accessibility features, the wider doorways, the roll-in shower, the motorized everything, had been selected by Greg over the course of 6 weeks of internet research conducted from his wheelchair in the apartment living room while Clara worked, because she was still working at this point, still maintaining her position as a senior graphic designer at a firm where she had spent 4 years building a reputation she was quietly, in this period, beginning to sacrifice. She had not yet understood that she was sacrificing it. She had understood that she was covering for absences, and managing late arrivals, and conducting client calls from hospital waiting rooms, and submitting work at 11 at night, after Greg was settled for the evening. But she had framed all of this as temporary, as the particular extra effort of a difficult period that would eventually resolve into something more sustainable. The period did not resolve. Greg hired a contractor to build a custom ramp at the front entrance of the new house and a secondary one at the back patio, and he selected the motorized wheelchair, a model that cost just under $10,000, and which he drove with the practiced ease of a man who had become very comfortable with his equipment. And he directed the placement of every piece of furniture with the specific authority of someone who had thought carefully about how the space would function for his needs. Clara had moved boxes. She had unpacked the kitchen alone, because Greg couldn't reach the upper cabinets, and arranged the bedroom alone, because Greg tired easily, and assembled the office furniture alone over a weekend in November while Greg watched football in the living room and periodically called through the wall to ask how much longer she thought it would take. She had quit her job 3 months after they moved in. This had not been a decision so much as a recognition. The firm had been patient. Her manager was a decent person who had understood, or tried to understand, that Clara's situation was genuinely difficult. But there was a category of absent that passed a threshold, and Clara had passed it, and the conversation had been kind, and the severance had been reasonable, and she had driven home from the office that afternoon and unpacked Greg's afternoon medication, and prepared his lunch, and not mentioned any of it until dinner. When Greg had looked at the food and said it needed more salt, she had added more salt. He had said it was fine. She had cleared the table. The nights were the worst, not because of what happened in them, which was mostly practical. The 2 a.m. turns, which the physical therapist had explained in the hospital were necessary to prevent pressure injuries in patients with limited mobility, and which Greg required every 2 hours throughout the night because he claimed to be unable to shift his own position. The turning took approximately 8 minutes. Clara would wake to the alarm she'd set on her phone, cross to Greg's side of the bed, and perform the maneuver she had been shown by the physical therapist, using the draw sheet and her own body weight to rotate him from one side to the other with the controlled, practiced movement of someone who had done it enough times to have developed a system. Greg usually woke during the turn. Usually he said something. It was rarely thank you. On a Tuesday in March of the first year, she had finished the 2 a.m. turn and was straightening the bedding when he said, without opening his eyes, that her hands were too cold and it was inconsiderate. She had put her hands under her own arms to warm them. She had done the 4 a.m. turn with warm hands. The soup incident was in October of the second year. She had made minestrone, a recipe she had been using for years from a cookbook her mother had given her, adjusted for the dietary restrictions Greg had developed since the accident, which were specific enough that she had written them on an index card she kept in the kitchen drawer. She had tasted it before she brought it to him. It was fine. It was the same soup she had made 8 times in the preceding year without comment. Greg tasted it and said it was too salty. She said she didn't think so, and she used the same amount of salt she always used. He said she was telling him his own experience was wrong. She said she wasn't. He threw the bowl, not at her or not precisely at her, not with the direct aim of something intended to make contact. He threw it in her direction, which was not the same thing but was close enough that the soup hit her arm before the bowl hit the floor. And the soup was hot, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with the heat of it on her forearm, and the bowl in pieces on the floor, and Greg in his wheelchair saying things about how she would never understand what it was like to lose everything, what it was like to be trapped, what it was like to need the one person who was supposed to love you unconditionally, and have them fail you consistently in the small daily ways that added up to abandonment. She had gotten down on the floor. She had cleaned up the soup. She had apologized. The dog was Buster, a golden retriever, 3 years old, who had belonged to them before the accident, and who had adapted to the new house with the uncomplicated goodwill of a dog, who had no position on the question of accessibility features. Buster was the reason for the camera. Clara had noticed, over a period of weeks, that Buster had developed what appeared to be a habit of chewing the corner of the area rug in the living room when left unsupervised. The corner was not visible from the kitchen or the hallway. She had considered deterrent sprays and had not gotten around to purchasing them. And in the meantime, she had ordered the pet camera, a small, wireless unit that ran on a rechargeable battery and connected to a phone app, marketed specifically for people who wanted to check on their pets during the day. $32. She had put it on the bookshelf in the living room, behind the row of design books she no longer had reason to consult, angled slightly downward to cover the rug. She had told Greg she was doing this. He had said fine. He had not asked to see the footage. She had plugged it in on a Thursday evening. On Friday morning, she drove to the pharmacy to pick up Greg's monthly prescription, a combination of pain management medications that the prescribing physician renewed each month, which Greg took on a schedule Clara maintained, and which she picked up because Greg's ability to leave the house was limited and the errand was straightforward. The pharmacy was 11 minutes away. She had been in the queue for 4 minutes when her phone buzzed. The notification was from the pet camera app. The icon was a small paw print. The text read, "Motion detected in living room." She looked at it. She thought, Buster is probably chewing the rug again. She opened the app. The live feed loaded in 3 seconds. The bookshelf at the edge of the frame. The morning light through the front window. The area rug at the center of the image. Buster was on his bed in the corner. He was asleep. He was not chewing anything. Clara looked at the center of the frame. The wheelchair was empty. Greg was standing in the middle of the living room. He was not struggling. He was not holding on to anything. He was standing with his weight distributed evenly across both feet, his arms at his sides, his posture upright in a way she had not seen it in 2 years. His face turned slightly toward the window in the particular attitude of someone checking the light. As she watched, he rolled his shoulders back. He reached his arms above his head and stretched. A long, full-body stretch. The kind that used every muscle in the back and the core and the legs. The kind that a person did when they had been sitting for a while and their body needed movement. He held it for a moment. He let it out. He did 3 deep lunges. Clara's phone slipped in her hand. She caught it before it hit the floor, but the woman in front of her in the line turned at the sound of her hand, catching the edge of the display shelf, and looked at Clara with the brief, assessing attention of someone who had heard an unexpected sound. And Clara was standing in the pharmacy line with her phone in both hands and the live feed still running and Greg now walking. Walking. The normal, unassisted, perfectly mobile walk of a person whose legs worked, toward the kitchen. Next, the pharmacist said. Clara looked up. She walked to the counter. She gave the prescription number. She waited for the medication. She signed for it. She walked out of the pharmacy to her car, and she sat in the driver's seat, and she looked at her phone, and she played the footage back from the beginning. She watched it twice. Then she drove home. She drove home the way she always drove home. This was a decision, though it did not feel like one at the time. It felt like the absence of decision, the continuation of momentum, the body doing what the body knew how to do when the mind had temporarily exceeded its processing capacity. She drove the 11 minutes from the pharmacy to the house on automatic, and she parked in the driveway, and she sat in the car for approximately 90 seconds. She looked at the front door. The ramp Greg had specified was visible from the driveway. The custom-built ramp with the non-slip surface and the angled approach calibrated for the turning radius of the motorized wheelchair, which had cost $4,000 to install, and which she had watched the contractors build over 2 days in September of the previous year while Greg directed them from the doorway, pointing out that the angle wasn't quite right, that the surface color didn't match the house trim, that the left handrail needed to be repositioned by approximately 2 inches. She looked at the ramp. She got out of the car. She went inside. Greg was in the wheelchair. He was positioned near the window in the living room where he usually spent the late morning, a spot he had described, early in the new house period, as the only place where he didn't feel completely trapped, where the light reminded him that the world was still there even if he couldn't be part of it. The motorized chair was angled slightly toward the window. His hands were in his lap. He had the particular quality of stillness that she had spent 2 years reading as the stillness of a man whose body had stopped cooperating, the energy-conserving immobility of someone for whom movement was costly. She understood now what that stillness actually was. He looked up when she came in. "You took too long," he said. "I dropped my phone and I couldn't reach it." The phone was on the floor near the front wheel of the chair, 6 inches from his foot. Clara looked at the phone. She looked at Greg. She bent down and picked it up. She placed it in his hand. She straightened. "I'm sorry," she said. The line was long. Something moved across his face, not quite satisfaction, but adjacent to it. The expression of a person whose expectation of an apology has been met and who has processed the apology and moved on. "My 2 o'clock meds," he said. "Of course," Clara said. "I'll get them right now." She went to the kitchen. She stood at the counter with the prescription bag in her hands, and she breathed through her nose for 4 seconds and out through her mouth for 4 seconds. The technique she had read about in a caregiver wellness article she had found at 2 in the morning 6 months ago when she had briefly allowed herself to look for something that described what her life felt like. She counted out his medication. She brought it to him with a glass of water. He took it without looking at her. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the sink and she thought about what she had seen on the live feed. And she thought about the 2 a.m. turns. And she thought about the soup on her arm. And she thought about the $4,000 ramp and the $10,000 wheelchair and the $5 million settlement, and the specific, sustained, 2-year performance she had just watched collapse in a $32 camera feed. She did not cry. She thought about what came next. She ordered the additional cameras that evening. Not from Amazon. She drove to an electronics store she had never used before, 40 minutes from the house, paid cash, and put the receipt in the bottom of her bag. She bought 3 units, different models than the first one, each slightly smaller, each with better low-light performance. She had looked up the specifications before she left. She shipped them to an Amazon locker 2 towns over, which she had set up that afternoon using the email address she had created in the pharmacy parking lot, from her phone, while Greg's medication was being filled. She was methodical. She had always been methodical. It was the quality that had made her good at her job, the ability to organize complexity into sequences, to understand what order things needed to happen in, to hold multiple variables simultaneously without losing track of any of them. She had spent 2 years applying this quality to caregiving, to the medication schedules and the turn routines and the dietary requirements and the appointment logistics. She understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its completeness, that she was now going to apply it to something else. The cameras went up over 3 days. She installed them during the windows when Greg napped. He napped in the early afternoon, reliably, a pattern she knew as well as his medication schedule, moving through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned, over 2 years, exactly how to exist in a space without making sounds that disturbed the person in it. She put one in the kitchen, angled toward the island and the back door, one in the hallway, one in the home gym that Greg had installed on the ground floor, the room with the exercise equipment he had explained when they moved in. He wanted available for the day when the doctors are wrong and I get some function back. She had found this touching at the time. The equipment in the home gym was not dusty. She had noticed this before, had registered it without processing it. The way you registered things that didn't fit the story you were operating inside of. The resistance bands hung on the wall in a slightly different configuration each time she went in to clean. The floor mat showed compression patterns that were not consistent with a stationary object. She had noticed. She had not allowed herself to understand. She understood now. The first significant footage came on a Wednesday. She was doing the grocery run. Wednesday afternoon was grocery day, a schedule she had maintained for 18 months, leaving at 2:30 and returning by 4. A window she had once mentioned in passing to Greg because she had needed him to know she would be unavailable by phone for portions of it if she was in the store. He had filed that information. She understood this now too. She was in the produce section when the motion alert came from the home gym camera. She pulled up the feed. Greg was in the home gym. He was not in the wheelchair. The wheelchair was visible in the hallway camera, stationary, empty, parked neatly the way she always parked it when he transferred to bed. On the gym camera, Greg was in the center of the mat in athletic shorts and a t-shirt, doing jumping jacks. Not attempting jumping jacks. Not approximating jumping jacks. Doing them full extension, both feet leaving the ground simultaneously, both arms completing the arc over his head, the easy, rhythmic motion of a body that was performing a familiar exercise without effort. He did 20. Then he stopped, rolled his neck, and moved into a sequence of bodyweight squats, slow, controlled, deep squats, the kind that required full joint mobility and significant lower body strength. His form was good. It was the form of someone who had been doing squats regularly. Clara stood in the produce section and watched him do 12 squats. She put 3 avocados in her basket. She went to the dairy aisle. She added everything to the folder. The escort came on a Saturday. She had left for the grocery store at the same time. She had, since the Wednesday footage, maintained her schedule with even greater precision. Because the schedule was what created the windows, and the windows were what produced the footage, and the footage was what she was building. The motion alert came 11 minutes after she left the house. She pulled over on a side street 2 blocks away. She opened the feeds. The front door camera showed a woman arriving, a woman Clara did not recognize, well-dressed, mid-20s, the specific quality of presentation that was the result of significant effort toward a specific impression. She rang the bell. The door opened. Greg opened the door. He was standing in the doorway, not in the wheelchair, standing upright, in the jeans and button-down shirt Clara had washed and folded and left in the closet 3 days ago, looking from the front door camera's angle, exactly like a man whose wife had left for the grocery store and whose plans for the afternoon had been arranged in advance. He smiled at the woman. He stepped back to let her in. The kitchen camera caught what happened next, the easy domesticity of it, the familiarity that existed between them, the way he moved through the kitchen with her with the unguarded comfort of someone at home in their own body and their own space. He opened the refrigerator. He handed her something. She laughed. He touched the small of her back. They went upstairs. Clara sat in the parked car for a while. She was not surprised, which was itself a form of information. The absence of surprise when something this significant was revealed told her something about what she had already known without knowing. She had been living adjacent to the truth for a long time. The truth was simply now visible. She went to the grocery store. She bought everything on the list. She came home at the usual time. The house was empty when she arrived. Greg was in the wheelchair near the window. The house smelled faintly of a perfume that was not hers. "Good trip," Greg said. "Fine," Clara said. "I got the salmon you wanted." She went to make dinner. The phone call was the last thing she needed, and she knew it when she heard it. It came on a Thursday afternoon, captured by the kitchen camera's audio. Greg on his phone at the island, which he had walked to, which he was leaning against with both elbows, which he was using in the way a person used a kitchen island when their back was tired and they wanted to take some weight off their feet. She had been watching the feeds from a coffee shop 4 blocks away, where she had developed the habit of spending 2 hours each afternoon under the pretext of a sensory break, a need for quiet away from the medical environment, which she had mentioned to Greg as something her doctor had recommended, which Greg had absorbed with the mild sympathy he applied to information that affected him minimally. The call was to Farrell. She recognized his voice from the consultations she had attended in the hospital. They were discussing something about a follow-up evaluation, a periodic documentation requirement, apparently, related to maintaining the settlement terms. She listened to Farrell explain something about the evaluation and Greg respond, and then the conversation shift. The way conversations shifted when the professional matter was resolved and the people on the call settled into something more informal. "How's the home situation?" Farrell said. "Perfect," Greg said. He had a specific quality of satisfaction in his voice that she had never heard before, or rather, that she had heard and had not understood, in the same way she had not understood the gym equipment. "She's completely brainwashed. I have her wiping my ass, and she apologizes for it." Farrell said something she couldn't make out. Greg laughed. "Best scam I ever pulled," he said. "Honestly, I'm serious. The whole thing, the doctor, the lawyer, all of it. Best decision I ever made." A pause. "She actually thinks she's failing me. She sets alarms to turn me in bed. You should see her face when I complain about something. Pure guilt." Another sound from Farrell, unintelligible. "Nah," Greg said. "She's not going anywhere. Where would she go? She hasn't worked in 2 years. She has no money of her own, and she thinks leaving a disabled husband is basically a crime against humanity." He paused. "She'd never do it." Clara stopped the playback. She sat in the coffee shop with her cup in front of her, and the mid-afternoon light coming through the window, and the ordinary background noise of a coffee shop going about its ordinary business. She had what she needed. She had had it for several days, technically. The footage alone was sufficient, she suspected, for the purposes she was building toward. But the phone call was something different. The phone call was Greg's voice, in his own words, in a private conversation he had not known was being recorded, describing the situation with the specific, unguarded accuracy of someone who never had to perform the truth because no one was listening for it. She had 104 hours of footage across all 4 cameras. She had the phone call. She had the escort footage. She had the gym footage. She had 21 days of Greg doing things that were, according to a settlement document that a trucking company's insurance carrier had paid $5 million to finalize, physically impossible. She opened her laptop. She had an appointment the following morning. The Special Investigations Unit of the insurance company operated out of a building downtown that looked, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. The agent she met with was a woman named Sandra Kim, who had the specific manner of someone whose job was to be skeptical, and who had learned, through years of practice, that the most effective form of skepticism was patient and quiet and willing to look at everything before forming an opinion. Clara had brought the USB drive. Sandra had looked at the footage for 47 minutes, which was longer than Clara had expected. When she looked up, her expression was the controlled expression of a professional who had learned not to show too much. "How long has this been going on?" Sandra said. "I've had cameras in the house for 21 days, Clara said. "I believe the fraud has been ongoing since the accident." 2 years. "Yes." Sandra looked at the footage again, not playing it, just looking at the paused frame on her screen. Greg in the home gym mid-squat. "I'm going to need to bring in federal law enforcement," Sandra said. "The scale of this, the amount of the settlement, the duration, the documentation," she paused. "This isn't just a civil matter." "I know," Clara said. "Mrs. Hayes, I want to make sure you understand what that means in terms of what happens next. The process." "I understand the process," Clara said. "I've been researching it for 3 weeks." She paused. "I'd like to be involved to the extent that's possible. I want to help you make this as airtight as it can be." Sandra looked at her for a moment. "You understand that once we bring federal agents in, your husband is going to be arrested?" "Yes," Clara said. "And you're prepared for that?" Clara thought about the 2 a.m. turns. She thought about the soup. She thought about Greg's voice on the phone, describing the feeling of watching her apologize for things she hadn't done. And the word he had used, brainwashed, and the satisfaction underneath it. The specific pleasure of a person who had found the precise mechanism of another person's suffering and had been operating it deliberately. Yes, she said. The FBI agent assigned to the case was named Special Agent Torres, and he spent 40 minutes with the footage before he said anything. What he said when he said it was, "We're going to need him caught in the act." Clara had expected this. She had read enough in the 3 weeks of research conducted on her laptop in the coffee shop and in the parked car and in the bathroom after Greg was settled for the night, to understand that documentary evidence of fraud was strong, but that a defendant in court was best served by a jury who had seen something undeniable, something that closed every possible interpretive gap. "Tell me about his schedule," Torres said. She told him about the windows, the grocery run, the errand patterns, the times she left and the times she returned. She told him about the party Greg had mentioned to a friend on the kitchen camera 2 weeks ago, the one he had been planning for a weekend when Clara was absent, the one he had described as a real party, not the pathetic little gathering she thinks I'm satisfied with. She told Torres about the caregiver retreat. She had not planned the caregiver retreat. It had presented itself. An article she had seen in the waiting room of the specialist's office about support programs for family caregivers had given her the language, and the language had given her the cover, and the cover had given Torres what he needed. "If you tell him you're going away for a weekend," Torres said, "and he fires the temporary nurse." "He will," Clara said. "He's done it before. He fired the last one I arranged in 40 minutes. Torres nodded. "He'll have the house to himself if he's been planning a gathering." "He'll have one," Clara said. "And we'll have the warrant by then," Torres said. "Federal warrants for wire fraud, insurance fraud, and perjury. The footage you've provided is sufficient for the warrants. We'll need to execute on a moment when he's demonstrably ambulatory in front of witnesses." Clara thought about Greg showing his friends his golf swing on the kitchen monitor. "He'll give you that," she said. She drew them a map of the house. She walked Torres through the layout, the entry points, the interior sight lines, the location of the wheelchair in the hallway, the kitchen where Greg spent most of his active hours. She walked them through the smart home system, which was connected to a hub she still had administrative access to, and which she had, with Torres' guidance, granted the technical team read-only access to for monitoring purposes. She had done this with the same methodical attention she had brought to 2 years of caregiving. The difference was that this time, she knew exactly what it was building toward. She told Greg about the retreat on a Thursday evening. She told him she had reached a limit. She used the language of the caregiver wellness articles she had read: compassion fatigue, burnout threshold, the necessity of self-care for sustainable caregiving, because these were words Greg had heard before in the context of her needs, and which he had always received with the specific quality of indulgence that he applied to things that inconvenienced him minimally. He said he supposed she deserved a break. He said it the way he said things that were concessions, with the weight of someone who was giving something, so that the giving would be remembered. She said she would arrange a temporary nurse. He said he didn't want some stranger in the house, but he understood. She booked the nurse through the agency they had used twice before. She confirmed the booking with Greg present. She packed a bag, visibly, the following morning, the bag she had been packing in stages for 2 weeks, adding things she did not intend to return for, in quantities small enough that the gradual accumulation was invisible. She told Greg she would be back Sunday evening. She kissed him on the forehead. He accepted it with his eyes closed. She picked up her bag. She drove away. The temporary nurse arrived at 11. She was gone by 11:42. Clara knew this because she was 2 blocks away, in the back of a surveillance van, watching the front door camera when Greg opened the door and told the nurse, with the particular authority of a man who had decided he was not interested in what was being offered, that her services weren't needed and she could go. The nurse left. The front door closed. For 3 minutes, nothing happened on the kitchen monitor. Then Greg walked in. He walked in the way he walked when he was alone, the full, natural gait of a person whose legs had never stopped working, unhurried, comfortable. He went to the refrigerator. He opened it. He took out a beer. He opened the beer on the counter edge. He picked up his phone. On the audio feed, they could hear the call connect. "Yeah, she's gone," Greg said. "Whole weekend, come over whenever." A pause. "Bring Marcus and call whoever else. I'm sick of this house being a hospital." He hung up. He turned the stereo on. The sound that came through the van's audio feed was loud enough that Tors raised an eyebrow. "He's not concerned about the neighbors," Tors said. "He's never been concerned about anything," Clara said. By 3 in the afternoon, 4 people had arrived. Clara recognized 2 of them from the kitchen camera footage, Greg's friends. The same ones who had been present at other windows. The ones who had drunk his beer and heard his stories and participated, whether knowingly or not, in the particular life he had built inside the life he performed for her. On the kitchen monitor, Greg was demonstrating something to the group. He had his feet shoulder-width apart. He was showing them his golf swing. Tors picked up the radio. He looked at Clara. "You ready?" he said. Clara looked at the monitor, at Greg on his feet in his kitchen, in the house she had cleaned and maintained and organized, and inhabited for 18 months as though the life in it were real. "Yes," she said. Tors keyed the radio. "All units," he said, "execute." The front door did not open. It ceased to exist as a door. The battering ram hit it once, and the frame cracked, and the second hit took it entirely. And 12 federal agents in tactical gear moved through the opening with the specific, trained efficiency of people executing a plan that had been rehearsed and refined, and was now simply being performed. "FBI, get on the ground, everybody down." The sound reached the van immediately through the audio feeds. The commands, the immediate chaos of 4 people in a room who had not been expecting this. The scramble of bodies and the knock of furniture and the particular disorienting noise of a controlled entry in a space that had been, 4 seconds ago, a private party. On the kitchen monitor, Clara watched Greg. He was the most interesting thing on any of the 4 screens. She watched him register the sound, the door, the commands, and she watched his body do what it had been trained to do, or what it had been performing the training of doing for 2 years. She watched him calculate, in the fraction of a second available for calculation, what the situation required. He dove for the wheelchair. The wheelchair was in the hallway, 12 feet from where he was standing, and he covered that distance not with the dragging, labored movement of a man with compromised mobility, but with the quick, instinctive movement of a person whose body responded without consulting their intentions. A run, essentially, disguised in the last 2 feet as a lunge toward the chair. He grabbed the armrests. He threw himself into the seat. By the time the first agent reached the kitchen doorway, Greg was in the wheelchair. "I'm paralyzed." His voice came through the feed and through the van walls simultaneously from inside the house. "I can't move. I'm a quadriplegic. I can't. You need to be careful. You need to." The agent who had reached him was a woman Clara had been briefly introduced to at the field office. Compact, experienced, the kind of person whose patience and speed were not in conflict with each other. She looked at Greg in the wheelchair. She looked at the kitchen floor, where the beer had landed when he dropped it running for the chair, and where the wet mark of it was still spreading across the tile in the direction that liquid spread when it fell from a standing height. She looked at Greg. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "my colleagues have been watching you do squats for a month." A pause. "Please stand up and walk to the door." Greg stared at her. His hands gripped the armrests. "I can't," he said. "I'm telling you I." The second agent had come around the other side. What happened next was not violent. It was not rough in the way that things could be rough in situations like this. It was simply the application of a decision that had been made. The agent took Greg's arm, and he stood, because the alternative to standing was being stood, and his body, which had never stopped working, stood. He stood on his own 2 feet, in his own kitchen, in front of 4 friends, who had spent the afternoon watching him demonstrate his golf swing. The cuffs went on while he was standing. He was read his rights. He was walked toward the door. The afternoon light hit the driveway at the angle of late autumn light, which was low and clear and specific, the kind of light that made the ordinary details of a suburban street look deliberate. Clara was standing beside the van. She had come out when she heard the all-clear come through Tor's radio. The single word that meant the house was secured. The subjects were in custody. The operation was complete. She had stepped out of the van into the afternoon and stood on the damp sidewalk across from the house where she had lived for 18 months, and she had waited. Greg came through the front door. He came through it on his feet, which was perhaps the simplest and most complete summary of everything. The man who had not been able to walk for 2 years, walking. His hands were cuffed behind him. He was wearing the jeans and the button-down from the closet. The beer was still on his shirt where some of it had splashed when he dropped it. He was looking at the ground. Then he wasn't. He looked up as people looked up when they emerged from a confined space into outdoor light. And he found the van. And he found the FBI markings on it. And he followed the natural line from the van to the person standing beside it. He found Clara. His face did several things in rapid succession. She watched them happen. She watched the sequence of realizations, the recognition, and then the extension of the recognition backward, the understanding spreading from this moment into the preceding weeks and then further back, trying to locate the point where the error had occurred, the place where his certainty had been misplaced, the moment when the person he had believed was brainwashed had stopped being brainwashed and become something else entirely. She watched him understand. She raised her hand. She gave him a small wave. Not aggressive, not triumphant. Just a wave. The kind of small gesture that acknowledged seeing someone, that said, "I see you," asterisk. That meant nothing more and nothing less than the fact of her presence and his, on this afternoon, on this street, in this specific and irreversible moment. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. The agent beside him continued walking. Greg walked with him. He walked on his own 2 feet. The way he had always been able to walk, down the custom-built ramp he had specified, across the driveway of the luxury smart home he had purchased with money that belonged to a trucking company's insurance carrier, and into the back of the federal vehicle idling at the curb. The door closed. Torres came to stand beside Clara. "He'll be processed downtown," he said. "Your attorney will have the paperwork for the divorce filing by Monday. The asset freeze is already in place. The insurance carrier's legal team filed this morning. They'll be pursuing full recovery of the settlement." Clara nodded. "And me," she said. "Whistleblower status is confirmed," Torres said. "You have 0 liability in the criminal proceedings. The civil recovery process for the insurance carrier runs separately from your divorce filing. Your attorney can advise you on the specific sequence, but the short version is," he paused, "you walk away clean." Clara looked at the house. The front door was still open. Or rather, the front door was still absent, the frame splintered, the opening where it had been simply an opening now. Through it she could see the hallway, and the wheelchair, still parked where Greg had abandoned it in his run for the kitchen. The wheelchair was empty. It had always been empty, in the way that mattered. She had just needed a $30 camera, and 3 weeks of her own attention to see it clearly. She did not go back inside the house. She had not planned this specifically. She had not said to herself, in the weeks of preparation, "I will not go back inside the house." It had simply resolved itself that way, in the way that certain things resolved when the situation was clear enough. She had the bag in the van. She had the documents Torres needed her to sign, which she signed on the van's fold-down table. She had her phone and her laptop, and the folder she had kept for 3 weeks. She did not need anything that was in the house. The things in the house were, most of them, things that had been purchased with the settlement money, which was now subject to federal asset recovery proceedings, which meant they belonged to a process rather than to either of the people who had lived among them. Her own things, the things she had brought to the marriage, the things she had owned before the accident and the wheelchair and the ramp, were not many, and were not in this house because she had not been the one who chose this house. She thanked Torres. She got in her car. She drove. She did not drive to the coffee shop or the electronics store or the Amazon locker or any of the places she had used in the past 3 weeks as the infrastructure of a plan that was now complete. She drove to her sister's house, 40 minutes away, where she had arranged to stay for the immediate period. And she drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the late afternoon moving through its light outside the windows. She thought about Buster. The golden retriever was currently at a boarding facility she had booked 3 days ago, under the pretext of the caregiver retreat. She had explained to Greg that the retreat facility didn't allow dogs, which was true of the retreat she was not going to, and he had said fine. And she had dropped Buster off on Friday morning, and Buster had gone with the uncomplaining goodwill of a dog who trusted that the people he loved were making decisions that made sense. She had already arranged to transfer Buster to the kennel's long-term boarding program. She would pick him up on Monday. On Monday, she would also call her old firm. She had emailed her former manager 3 weeks ago, a brief, low-key message, the kind that opened a door without committing to walking through it, asking whether there might be any freelance opportunities worth discussing. The response had come within a day, always. "Call me when you're ready." She was ready. She drove through the late afternoon. She thought about the 2 a.m. turns. She thought about the soup. She thought about the phone call, best scam I ever pulled, and the specific quality of pleasure in Greg's voice when he had said it. The enjoyment of a person who had been operating a mechanism and found the operation satisfying. She thought about the $30 camera on the bookshelf. She thought about the motion alert in the pharmacy line. She thought about sitting in the coffee shop for 3 weeks with her laptop and her phone and the cold, building clarity of someone who had found the edge of a thing and was working methodically toward its end. She had worked methodically. She had reached the end. Buster was at the kennel. Her sister's porch light was on. The fraud had been running for 2 years. The footage had taken 3 weeks. And Greg Hayes, who had spent 2 years in a wheelchair he didn't need, on a claim he had fabricated, maintained by a woman he had called brainwashed on a recorded phone call, was currently being processed in a federal facility downtown, facing 20 years on his own 2 perfectly healthy feet. She pulled into her sister's driveway. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, which was the particular quiet of an ending, not the empty quiet of something lost, but the full quiet of something completed. The silence that came after a very long task had been finished, and the space where the task had been was now simply space. She picked up her bag. She got out of the car. The evening air was cold and clean. She breathed it. She walked up the porch steps. Her sister opened the door before she knocked. "Hi," her sister said. "Hi," Clara said. She went inside. The door closed behind her. She was done.